A true confession requires an awareness that the behavior is not just pleasurable, but also defensive. They begin to see that the affair, the pornography, the spending, or the drinking is not just about pleasure or stress relief, which of course it could be, but it is also serving as an escape from more painful feelings, some of which would include vulnerability, dependency, inadequacy, anxiety, depression, or emotional need, just to name a few. Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. As many of you know, we've recently covered a lot of complicated ground, from lying, secrecy, living a double life, to differentiating between borderline and narcissistic personality organizations. As we move forward into new content, I also want to slow down and consolidate, not to repeat what we've already covered, but to refine it, to revisit key themes through the lens of your questions and lived experiences. This is what we're now calling, and I quote, the Consolidation Series. This episode continues the series, and I just want to remind you the goal isn't about quick answers. The questions that come in and observations are quite complicated. So what we're doing here is more about thinking psychodynamically together about your questions and comments, not one specific answer. And even in the answers that I'm providing, which are not really answers, they're my thoughts about your questions, they're not complete. Even though I'm dedicating a full podcast, you hear me say this all the time, but I want to really impress upon you that since these are quite complicated, there are many different ways to think about them. I'm going to show you. I'll give you this by way of an example. So here's the example that I just mentioned. One of the themes that keeps resurfacing in your emails and comments has to do with the secrecy episodes that I released recently. These questions and comments are not just about secrecy as deception, but the thought that secrecy is a refuge and could be experienced as a safe place. And that brings me to a question a listener sent in, a really thoughtful one that I think is going to help consolidate what we were building over that series on secrecy. She writes, I have a few questions on your latest episode regarding secrets that maybe you can elaborate on. What if the secret is being kept because the person wants to continue engaging in the secretive behavior? Admitting it, that's admitting the secret. Admitting it would then necessitate stopping the behavior. Admitting would interfere with, and she quotes from the podcast, an escape. So admitting would interfere with the escape. That's what Steiner calls the psychic retreat into the false world. So they can no longer escape into the false world of comfort, pleasure, control, or whatever that world consists of. Wouldn't the admission of this kind of secret require some awareness that the secret is a problem in the first place? So there you have it. Those are some of the questions that have been coming in around the secret. So what actually happens if the person admits, let's say, that they're having an affair, they're addicted to pornography, they're using pain medication, or are engaging in financial infidelity, spending all the family's money in secret, or accumulating debt, or maintaining hidden accounts. These are just a few examples. You could fill it in here in terms of what's relevant to you and what you know about secrets. So what happens if the person admits this? And right here is where I want to slow this down and unpack it very carefully. Here's how I would begin to approach these questions, again, from a psychodynamic perspective. It depends. See, this stuff is complicated, I mentioned. It depends on the structure. That means the psychological position from which admitting to the secret is made. If it's coming, right? That's something we want to ask and assess. Is the admission coming from a genuine awareness and surrender, or is it coming from fear, pressure, or even an attempt to manage consequences? So, to zoom right into the listener's question, Does admitting it, that's the secret, interfere with, and again I quote, an escape or a collapse into the psychic retreat? And the answer is not necessarily. An admission only collapses the retreat into the secret world if the way they are admitting it makes it psychologically impossible to keep living in that fantasy world at the same time. Let me give you a for instance. If someone not only confesses to an affair, but also ends the relationship, gives up secrecy, allows transparency with their phone or finances, and is willing to tolerate the shame and loss of control, whatever the control is around the secret, all of that will follow. So if they're willing to do that, then the retreat truly begins to collapse. But if the admission still leaves room to secrecy or to preserve the behavior, either internally or externally, then the retreat survives. See, so in other words, just admitting it does not necessarily lead to the collapse of the retreat, the secret. This is what we can call this, and I quote, a false admission or a false confession. The false connection that I just mentioned, this is not really a surrender of the retreat. It's not a real giving up of the secret world. It's more of a strategy to calm things down. In other words, it's a maneuver to stabilize external reality while preserving internal access to that secret world. The person is trying to stop the fight, let's say, or reduce the threat of losing a relationship, or avoid the consequences of the secret, while still keeping their escape, their secret, intact. So in other words, the person may actually admit just enough. They may actually express remorse, and they may even make promises that things are going to be different. But the core attachment to the behavior and fantasy may not shift at all. They still experience the affair, the pornography, the drinking or drugs, the fantasy life as relief, comfort, control, or internal regulation, or whatever the secret means to them psychodynamically. So, internally, the retreat remains intact, unfortunately. Sorry to say that, especially for some of you who are in this position. And perhaps that's why these questions come in, because someone admits to the secret, but then you realize nothing is really changing. And that's what I'm getting at, is internally, the retreat remains intact. And what this means is psychologically, they are still organized around the secret world as their place of soothing or power or whatever it means to them. In this version, the retreat survives because it was never psychologically relinquished. They may say the words, but they have not emotionally surrendered the function the secret serves. So again, I'm sorry to say, but no, not in this version. Admitting it does not interfere necessarily with, and I quote again from the listener, an escape. The retreat remains psychologically intact. They absolutely can confess, right? They can confess and admit and return to the secret life. In fact, sometimes confession temporarily strengthens the retreat because it relieves external pressure while preserving that inner structure that I'm trying to describe here. But what if the admission is not voluntary? So, we just looked at when admitting is controlled, right? The person is in control of confessing. What happens when it isn't? What happens when the person doesn't choose to admit it, but is caught or exposed? That brings us to a different configuration. Let's go into the next scenario. We can call this, and I quote, the caught scenario. Let's say someone is caught, or that you're caught hiding a secret. If they are caught, the retreat may be punctured, but not dismantled. In other words, the secrecy is exposed, But the psychological need for the secret world is still very much alive, a little bit like scenario number one that I just detailed. What collapses is the illusion of invincibility, not necessarily the inner need for the retreat itself. They can no longer pretend they were unseen or untouchable. The fantasy of, and I quote, I can do this and no one will know, is shattered because, again, they're caught, they're exposed. But, but the internal landscape, right? The internal need to escape, the affair, again, the pornography, the pills, whatever the fantasy life is, may still remain necessary. The secret retreat then shifts form. It may become more covert. The person becomes more careful, more strategic, more hidden. The behavior goes underground rather than disappearing. The secret may become more dissociated. Dissociated means split off. They psychologically split it off. Like, in other words, I'm paraphrasing, that's not really me. Or, that was just stress. I just did that as a stress release. They compartmentalize the behavior so they don't have to fully feel it. Or, finally, the secret may become organized around grievance. In other words, that could look something like this. Well, you made me have this affair because you were emotionally unavailable. See, the grievance then is directed at you. So instead of confronting their dependency on the retreat, on the secret, whatever it may be, the drug, for instance, they reorganize the story around blame. Okay, so right now we've covered a few different responses to these questions. A controlled confession and forced exposure. That's the court scenario. So now, let's look at one more possibility. In both of these scenarios we just covered, the secret is still being protected. So what would it look like if the retreat into the secret world actually began to collapse? Not because someone was caught, not because they were pressured, but because something shifted internally. That brings us to the third and final configuration. And if you have any other iterations of this, please feel free to let me know. I'm curious how you're thinking about this. But in this third configuration, which is the genuine collapse of the secret, and then accompanied by the loss of omnipotence. Again, let's return to the listener's comment and questions, because now in this final configuration, admitting, and I'm quoting her, admitting it, that's the secret, may actually include some genuine awareness and holds the greatest potential, again to the listener's point, of stopping the behavior. So in other words, this is the configuration that actually may lead to the behavior stopping. This iteration is different. This is not about being caught. It's not about managing consequences. It's about a real psychological internal shift. A true confession that collapses the secret life requires a few things. A true confession requires an awareness that the behavior is not just pleasurable, but also defensive. They begin to see that the affair, the pornography, the spending, or the drinking is not just about pleasure or stress relief, which of course it could be, but it is also serving as an escape from more painful feelings, some of which would include vulnerability, dependency, inadequacy, anxiety, depression, or emotional need, just to name a few. A true confession that collapses the secret life also requires a willingness to tolerate the loss of omnipotence. Because remember, the retreat into the secret world often provides a sense of control, power, or fantasy, mastery. So giving it up means accepting limitations. That's what I meant about giving up one's omnipotence. This is giving up the whole grandiose structure that holds the narcissist together. So giving it up means accepting limitation, uncertainty, accepting that they are not all powerful, They're not above need. They're not immune to pain or anxiety. That's a big developmental step. It reflects growth in emotional capacity, the ability to tolerate reality without fleeing into fantasy or secrecy. And again, to the listener, you're absolutely right. This level of confession requires some awareness. Remember, that was the initial question. Do they have awareness that the secret is a problem, but only in this configuration? Not just that it causes trouble, but that it reflects something unresolved inside oneself. Without that awareness, the person does not experience the retreat as a problem. They experience it as a necessity, that it is necessary. In other words, it becomes the person's primary way of regulating emotion. It soothes anxiety, numbs shame, restores a sense of power, and protects against feelings of dependency or inadequacy, again, just to name a few. Over time, the person does not just enjoy the secret retreat, they rely on it. If the retreat is their primary emotional regulator, it can feel like losing the very structure that keeps them emotionally intact. We have to pause here for now. I appreciate you taking the time to listen so carefully and to raise such complicated and important questions. Okay, everyone, I hope you enjoyed this, again, I quote, consolidation episode. Please let me know what you think. I'll be doing a few more of these in the coming weeks. And as always, continue to send me your questions and observations. I may use them in a future episode. I read all your comments and I truly appreciate them. If this spoke to you and you're curious to learn more about all issues related to narcissism, please support the show by subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. And even more importantly, take a moment to leave a review. Reviews make the podcast easier for others to find, which helps the show grow. The more the show grows, the more I can invest in creating thoughtful content that supports you in understanding and navigating your experiences with narcissism. Okay, thanks for being here with me. I'm grateful we got to explore this one together. Until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.